Good evening. Last Tuesday, May 7th, Tony Amadeo passed away at a hospital in Texas. Tony was a former client and a longtime friend of the Southern Center for Human Rights. So we wanted to start tonight's program by remembering him. When Tony was 9 years old, his family was driving through the night from Georgia to Texas. They were going to celebrate Christmas with family, and so the car was packed with children and with Christmas presents. And then a truck veered from the opposite lane and collided with them, and Tony's parents and one of his sisters were killed instantly. Tony and his other sister survived. And from that point on, they were moved from foster home to foster home and other places for the remainder of their childhood. At an early age, Tony began struggling with substance abuse issues. And he turned 18 years old. Tony joined the Marines. He was still struggling, though. And one day he left his Marine Corps base with two other young men, and they ultimately carried out a series of robberies, and Tony shot and killed a man named James Turk. This was 1977 in Putnam County, Georgia. A trial was held a couple months later. It took 2 days. Tony was convicted and sentenced to death. The state argued that Tony was so beyond the possibility of redemption that he needed to be eliminated from the human community. A few years later, Steve Bright, who's pictured up here with Tony, and Palmer Singleton, Robert McGlasson, Mary Sinclair, and others at the Southern Center began working on Tony's case. The state of Georgia was doing everything it could to kill Tony. They were moving him through the appellate and post-conviction process. But then a new issue arose in the mid-1980s. It turned out that the district attorney in Putnam County had instructed the jury commissioners to underrepresent black citizens and women on the master jury list. And this came to light years after Tony's trial. So Steve and the team litigated the issue, and it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in June of 1988, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of Tony, and his conviction and death sentence were set aside. On remand, he was then resentenced to life in prison. The death penalty at that point was finally off the table. Now, to say that Tony made the most of his time in prison would be a massive understatement. There was a college program in the Georgia Department of Corrections at the time, and so Tony, now having a life sentence, started taking classes. And then he took more classes, and more classes, and more classes, and Tony Amadeo graduated from Mercer University, summa cum laude. This is him at the graduation ceremony with Steve Bright and Bill Warner. Tony also worked in the prison wood shop, and he provided hospice care for incarcerated people who were sick and dying. Steve Bright has said that he's never seen anyone do so much with his time in prison. In 2015, this is many years later, the Southern Center had the privilege of representing Tony in a parole proceeding. And Tony was granted parole. By that point, he had served 38 years in prison. 38 years. On the day he was released, Tony came directly to the Southern Center. This is Tony with Palmer Singleton, who passed away recently, and was a longtime Southern Center attorney. And this is Tony with many of us at the office that same day. Tony then moved to Texas. This was 2015. He worked as the operations manager of a ranch there. He was responsible for hundreds of cattle. He got to spend a lot of time with his cousins. He never had another interaction with the legal system. He stayed a part of the Southern Center family. He even came to Washington, D.C. one year for a Southern Center event. And there's Tony with Maya Chowdhury, former Southern Center staff member. A few years ago, Tony was asked in an interview, "Do you think you repaid your debt to society?" Tony said, "No, it will never be paid. Every day I think about that." He went on to say, quote, "You can't undo mistakes. You can't undo the tragedies of your life. All you can do is take one step at a time, one day at a time, trying to be the best person that you can be." Tony did that. He was kind, thoughtful, caring. He was a loving person. Sarah Tatanchi, a former director of the Southern Center, who's here tonight, said this: "Tony was a person who epitomized the life approach of doing all things with love. His kindness, gentleness, humility, and sense of humor came through so abundantly. Tony was such an easy person to love and to receive love from." We have a video from about 6 or 7 years ago that includes Tony speaking about his life. We're going to play a brief clip from it.
If I could go back 40 years and speak to the 18-year-old I was then, I would caution you to think and act in a way that wasn't harmful to myself and to others. Being able to visit with family and friends and experience the issues in their life and be a part of their life is a blessing. I enjoy going outside early in the morning, watching the sun rise, listening to the birds, and it's just phenomenal for me. It's so enjoyable to experience these things.
It was a tremendous privilege for all of us to get to work with Tony and to get to know him. Tony was a testament to the power of redemption and a reminder to never lose hope. We will miss Tony Amadeo, and we will keep his memory alive as we press forward. Thank you.